What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got the perfect leveling guide for the witch going from level 1 to 40. Now, by the time you hit 40 to 45 is when you really start to hone in on what type of build you want for the witch itself, whether it be something to do with minions or spells with critical or possibly even chaos damage with curses, or some type of hybrid of a mix of any one of the combination you have in front of you. But before that, it can feel almost a little bit underwhelming with the witch if you're just going off in too many different directions, getting a little bit of each one of these things and not really capitalizing on any one of them, or possibly synergizing them as well. Especially if you're going for something like minion damage early on, it can feel pretty underwhelming, especially before you've leveled into the point of getting some of the other specific minions that are really powerful, and we'll talk about that as we go along through here. But this is going to be the perfect blueprint to where by the time you hit 40 to 45, and with this skill tree setup and the skills we'll be talking about later on in the video, this is going to set you up perfectly for giving you everything that you need to clear through that content, clear through the bosses, have a much smoother experience, and feel powerful and impactful with everything that you're utilizing as you go through the campaign and get to the point where you can start narrowing in that build later on to be the most powerful witch build you can possibly be. Now, that being said, we're going to start off with a skill tree, and we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's get straight into it. Now, coming here down to the bottom, over to the left, we're going to be starting with the spell and minion damage and working our way along that over to the left side, getting each one of these spell and minion damage nodes all the way up to raw destruction right here. Now, at this point, you have two routes that you could actually take, whether or not you want more spell and critical damage, or if you want more minion damage. This is going to be one of those moments. If you want more minion damage, go straight up the center and get that Power of the Dead, giving a little bit more of the damage and attack speed and cast speed for the dead. But generally, if you're looking for something that's going to be the bigger bang for your buck, the left side for physical damage and the jagged shards that gives you the critical hit chance with spells and more physical damage is going to end up being a lot more powerful at the very beginning than just getting the flat 15% damage for your minions, as you won't have too many minions in the beginning and their damage output isn't going to be the greatest, and any time that they die, obviously that's a huge loss in your DPS. So in general, the jagged shards and the left side of this portion is going to give you the bigger bang for your buck early on, and we'll be able to slot in those nodes later on if you're looking for that minion build, so don't even worry about that in the coming future. But from that point, we'll be heading north over to the spell and minion damage, and then at this point we've got our first attribute point, which we're going to be slotting in intelligence, and from this point we need to head left immediately as you're leveling. Now, our next node we're going to throw on strength, as we will be utilizing a scepter with this. If you're not utilizing a scepter, you can't really go wrong with having an additional strength, as you will need that strength attribute a little bit higher as we go forward, as you'll need it for different skill gems and their supporting gems alongside them in order to slot those in. And after that, heading over to the left, we'll get another of the 5 intelligence over here, and then heading up, we've got our first cluster of nodes that we'll need to grab up along this left side, going with the damage against ailments all the way to the top with exploit the elements. Now, by the time you have exploit the elements, we will have essentially a 60% increase to our damage output towards any one of the enemies we inflict with an elemental ailment, whether it be burning, shock, or chill, which we will be doing with this build specifically. A whole lot of burning and a whole lot of chill and freezing with this, so we're going to be capitalizing on this, as well as having a 30% increased chance to inflict those ailments on rare and uniques and boss units this includes. So anytime that we're using firewall, which is going to be a major component to our build, which will be able to create burning damage on just about every enemy we face off with very easily. So we're essentially at the beginning just boosting our overall damage output by another 60%, but sadly enough, this will not affect the minions' damage output. It will just affect our damage output with any one of our spells. But after grabbing up that node, we'll start heading over to the right. We'll grab up another node that just increases our attributes by another 5 for the strength. And then before we head south, we're actually going to head over here to the right. We'll be grabbing up another one of those intelligence by 5, and then moving down here towards the spell damage. And we'll be grabbing each one of these nodes, giving us another 60% increase to our overall spell damage. Now, we will have a little bit of a nerf by a 5% reduced cast speed, but we can mitigate that later on, either with a jewel or possibly some of our gear that we may have that ends up giving us a bit more of that cast speed. But you can't go wrong with having another 60% increase to our spell damage, so technically by this point we have somewhere around a 120% increase to our overall damage output from any one of our spells, especially if we have them with those ailments. Now, from that point we'll be heading back to the strength node and then heading south to grab up the spell critical damage, the spell critical chance, the spell critical chance at the bottom, as well as the critical overload. Now, this is basically going to give us a 35% increase to our critical strike chance, a little bit of critical strike damage increase, as well as anytime that we do crit, we will also further increase our overall spell damage by another 15% a short time after some of those crits. So overall, we're just compounding on our overall damage output here, increasing our capability of getting those crits and just increasing our overall DPS. Now from that point, we'll head back over to above the spell damage node and start going north to grab up some of this minion life over here, all the way into the point we get necrotized flesh, giving us a 70% increase to our minions' overall life pool. Now the big reason we grab this up, and especially without grabbing up some of the minion damage, is we're going to be utilizing some of the minions later on, as there's 2 of them we can use, and one of them will be even more powerful than the other. But in general, we're trying to get a passive elemental ailment from either one of these, whether it be chill or possibly ignite, to start some of that burning. And the burning one with the arsonist can be extremely powerful. It can end up being quite damaging even without increasing the overall minion damage itself, but either one of these is going to be a little bit life-saving, and we'll be talking about them a little bit later on. But the big thing is just giving us the capability of having them sustain in the background to give us the capability of passive elemental ailment inflicted on those enemies in front of us, and a bit of meat shielding. Now from that point, going back to the strength node, we'll start heading up north, and we'll be stopping over here on the left to give ourselves the spell critical damage, another spell critical damage, and then a sudden escalation, further increasing our capability of getting those critical hits, as well as increasing our cast speed after a critical hit. So we will kind of mitigate that 5% reduction of our cast speed with this by giving ourselves another 3% increase with the 8% from recently critting, and just overall giving us a bit more damage out of those crits with these nodes. Now from that point, we'll start heading north, grabbing up more intelligence, and we're going to bypass this cluster above us first and go straight over to the left. We'll also get a jewel socket. Now if you don't know what a jewel is, or if you haven't gotten a jewel just yet, just head over to Path of Exile to trade, search up any jewel, throw in anything that's either going to boost your defenses, maybe even boost cast speed. Just look for certain things that just may be a benefit to you. Generally, any jewel that you're going to slot in early game is going to be a benefit for you, but if you're looking for something specific, try and find something that increases your cast speed by a little bit. Generally, I think early on, especially even for a rare one, you're more than likely going to get a max of 4, or you're generally going to get a max of 4% increase to that cast speed, but it may have other modifiers that will end up benefiting you as well. But heading over to the left, we'll be dropping down over here into the fire damage, and all the way at the bottom, the big one we want is intense flames. Now we're going to get a 35% increase to damage with hits against burning enemies. This is capitalizing on the fact that we're using flame wall on everything. We're consistently applying this burning damage to just everything that we see. So not only is it going to be 60% when we drop down that flame wall, but we'll also have another 35% on top of that. So we're all the way up to 95% increase to damage against any enemy that we're basically hitting with our flame wall from that point, with anything that we hit right after that. So it's going to be a massive damage increase from that point. But right after that, that's when we'll start to head over here to this cluster of nodes over here with Elemental, increasing our overall elemental damage by another 20%, and then giving us the capability of Exposure Effect, which this will just end up giving us the capability of igniting those enemies or giving that chill a little bit easier, as well as increasing our build up to Ignite and Freeze. So we'll be freezing and igniting those enemies, giving us even more damage output with some of those elemental ailments. But at the very top, the Stormbreaker is the one we want, where we have 15% increase to damage for each type of elemental ailment on an enemy. So effectively at this point, we're getting another 30%. So we're really capitalizing on that damage from this point. But that's going to be the full 1 to 40 skill tree right there. And if you want to focus more on minions than you do want to focus on critical strike and spell damage, you could end up just taking out the points right here for the spell critical and the ones to the south of that, and grab those up and just be able to slot in the points over here for the Relentless Fallen, the minion damage over here as well. And you'll have another 3 nodes of minion damage up top here as well. That will be very easy to just slot in and increase the overall damage output of your minions alongside your spell damage that you're inflicting, as this will give you enough to basically make the minions a bit more viable, a bit more damage. They won't be overpowered, but they'll be compensating you for the lack of critical strike chance that you'll have with this, but you'll still have all the damage you'll need in order to progress forward, and then still feel like you have an impactful minion build until you start focusing more on the minions as you go forward from this point. Which it's very easy to start respecking some of these points at this point once you're at 40 to 45 to be able to really hone in on the capability of the minions themselves. And definitely 100%, I would say the Arsonist is going to be the #1 minion you'll want to start looking at for that type of minion build that's going to be strong enough to progress all the way through the campaign and into end game. But now let's head over to the gems and start talking about which ones you want to start utilizing as your skills, as well as some of the supporting gems that'll make them even more powerful as you progress forward. Now when it comes down to the skills we'll want to use, the first one we're going to talk about is Contagion. It's a pretty powerful spell. It's not one that I'd say early game is going to be the #1 thing that's just going to be melting enemies, but it is going to give a good bit of damage, and it's going to be something that can passively have a lot of damage coming in for crowd control and clearing out some of those packs pretty quickly. Now with Contagion, we do have a modifier to where any bit of the spell damage we have as an increase is going to actually modify the damage over time that we have with this. So every bit of the spell damage we got in the skill tree and some that we'll have on our gear is going to increase the damage of this. And on top of that, the more that it spreads, the more damage it actually deals as well, up to a total of 300%. So every time that it dumps, it just doubles its own damage until it's at the triple point. And one other thing to highlight about this, to keep Contagion continuously going forward, is anytime you have one of those corpses on the ground that did have Contagion on it when it died, you'll actually be able to raise minions off of those, and the minion itself will have Contagion on it and be able to carry it forward. Now whether or not once it actually spreads the Contagion to the enemy that it's striking, it goes to a 200% increase, or whether or not it had 300% on it from spreading beforehand is something to test later on. I don't really know how to test that. You could probably ask somebody else. But in general, it's pretty much going to be either 200% increase as soon as it carries that from the minion to the next enemy that it's striking, or it's going to automatically push it into the 300% increase category. And you'll notice pretty quickly, especially with the next skill that we're going to be talking about, that it can start spreading and dealing quite a bit of damage, and you'll be clearing through some of those packs in the early game fairly easily just by throwing a couple of these Contagion spells on just 1 or 2 enemies in some of the crowd and letting it just spread as you're moving through some of those maps. And some of the supporting gems that would be worthwhile putting on this would be Persistent, increasing the skill effect duration by 40%, also Swift Affliction, which is just going to add more to the damage over time by another 35%, and later on, if you do end up getting a third socket for this through the Jeweler's Orb, Hinder is going to be a perfect slot in at the very tail end of this for the third supporting gem, as it will also decrease their movement speed by another 30% from the chaos damage over time from this. So not only are you having something that's dealing quite a bit of damage, increasing its damage over time as it's spreading, but on top of that slows down the enemies by 30% once you've got this leveled up to the point where you have the Hinder capability. You can't go wrong with it. It's a powerhouse. Now coming up right after that, our next skill is going to be Unearth. This is going to give us a little bit of a cone effect in front of us that'll just shoot out some spikes. Now not only is it going to be dealing some physical damage and have a little bit of that AoE, but anytime that you cast this over corpses, it will raise the bones of those corpses and create a bone construct that'll last for 12 seconds. Now I can't remember how many you'll have as the limit in the beginning. Right now I've got 16 of them, but you will be able to create a substantial amount of these bone constructs. They're super fast, they have fast attack speed, and if you've got some of those corpses on the ground with Contagion, they'll carry on Contagion as well and be able to inflict that on those enemies going forward. And this is one of those synergetic combinations, especially early on with Contagion and Unearth, that can be really powerful at clearing through some of those mobs and making you have a faster rate of clearing through those enemies, getting those levels up and that experience, and making it on to the next portion of the map that you're in. Now later on with Unearth, it will generally become one of those skills that you'll be utilizing just purely to get those minions out there, creating a little bit more of those meat shields, but also just spreading that Contagion. You'll be kind of casting this every once in a while just over the corpses to create those minions and create that synergetic combination, but it can still be a powerful skill in the early game. And when it comes down to the supporting gems, I've applied Magnified Effect, giving a 40% increase to its area of effect, creating a larger cone and spreading it out further. That way I don't have to be as close with this, and I can cover a lot more of the corpses in just one cast of this to be able to get some of those bone constructs up. And then right after that we'll have Brutality, which supported skills deal 35% more physical damage, as we won't be doing any elemental or chaos damage with this. The only thing that we'll actually be able to inflict is bleeding with this, but that'll be later on if we do have the skill points for that. Now coming up right after that, we've got Flame Wall, which I'd almost say this is essential in pretty much every single build with the Witch. Everybody's going to be using Flame Wall, as it's just going to give you the easiest capability of applying burning or elemental ailment to any one of the enemies in front of you. It's got decent damage on top of that, as well as anytime that you throw up Flame Wall in front of you, especially when you have projectiles coming from an enemy, it will completely block those projectiles. You can save yourself from any one of the projectiles, even the boss's projectiles. I've utilized this to save some of my friends while we're playing co-op in many different boss fights in order to just block off large portions of projectiles and make myself a little bit more of a support player as well as DPS in the passive element. But on top of that, we'll also be able to shoot projectiles through our own Flame Wall and add fire damage to them. So not only is it one of those that perfectly is giving us the capability of being able to just protect ourselves, but also increase our damage output and easily apply burning damage to any enemy in front of us. And when it comes down to the supporting gems, I put Arcane Tempo in here. That way we've got a 25% more cast speed with this one. That way it's just faster, as the capability of being able to lay this down. Right after that, I've got Inspiration, which just makes it cost less. That way I can just keep spamming that Flame Wall anytime I need to apply that burning effect to enemies, getting a bit more of that damage, giving a bit more protection for myself and my minions, and giving me the capability of just being able to get behind that and add that fire damage to some of my projectiles. Now later on, you could throw something like Spell Echo onto this, to where it's going to give you a larger area of effect, just making it a longer Flame Wall in front of you, and it may come at the cost of a 30% less cast speed, but if you've already got the 25% increase, all we have is a 5% reduction right here. So we've mitigated that and made it still something that we can keep spamming out there to get as many of those actual Flame Walls out there and keep sustaining that burning effect on those enemies in front of us. And right after that, we'll talk about the minions you may want to use early game. Obviously, it's going to be Skeletal Warrior. Not much to really say beyond this. It's going to be one of the cheapest ones that you can utilize your spirit for, and the things that we'll be using on this is going to be Meat Shield, basically making them have a larger portion of life, even though they're dealing less damage. And I also put Minion Instability on this, so by the time they hit the low portion of their life, they explode, dealing 15% of their maximum life as fire damage. And since we've increased their total life pool, that 15% is going to be a bit more substantial with that fire damage, and a lot of times the Skeletal Warriors are going to be in the face of some of those units, especially boss units, so it'll capitalize on still being able to dish out some of that damage even if they die. But you could also put on the support skill Last Gasp. That way they can maintain for another 4 seconds after they've technically died in meat shielding or just holding down that enemy from you. Either way, it's going to be up to you, but I prefer the one that ends up still applying some of that damage later on, as the Last Gasp is something I would prefer on some of our other elemental ailment inflicting minions rather than on the Skeletal Warriors. And the next skill that we'll be talking about is going to be Frostbolt, which is going to be one of our main attack moves that we'll be utilizing in order to get a little bit of that crowd control, and we'll also be able to add another one of those elemental ailments onto the enemies with Chill and be able to freeze them later on. Now with Frostbolt, we'll basically just throw in a Frost Orb in front of us that slowly moves forward, and anytime that it hits one of the enemies, it'll start applying that chill and some of that damage, and then pass through them until it hits a point of a certain distance and then explodes. But it will be able to pass through enemies and hit multiple enemies, and below that, the ground that it does actually go over is going to be chilled, creating more areas of effect with that chill that may be inflicted on enemies that move through that. So we're capitalizing on more elemental ailment alongside the burning effect, and we will be able to synergize this with the firewall, as we'll be able to fire this projectile through the firewall from behind it and be able to add fire damage to that, which I find pretty funny, as we basically have flaming ice balls going forward from this point, or frost fireballs. I love some of the combinations in this game. But from that point, when it comes down to the supporting skills, we'll be going for Scatter Shot immediately. That way we've got 3 of those frost balls going out. We will get a cost of 20% damage and 20% cast speed. You won't notice the cast speed or the damage, as we've got too much of the amplified damage from the skill tree. And on top of that, if you do end up hitting one enemy with all 3 of the orbs, that 20% is actually dealing more damage than it's dealing more damage than the actual damage that's been taken away from the one orb that it's hitting. And we're gaining a lot more of that area of effect in which we can actually cause some of that chill and building up some of that freeze towards some of those enemies, especially when it comes down to crowds. We'll be having a larger radius in which we can actually hit with this attack, and as it slowly goes forward and just keeps inflicting that chill on them. And just right after that, encumbrance just to add to the slow effect that we'll be applying with each one of the chills that we'll be putting on each one of the enemies while this passes through them by another 15%. Now coming up right after that, we've got Pain Offering. This is just to enhance our minions that we'll be utilizing. This will give them 30% increase to their attack speed as well as their cast speed, and the cast speed benefits us with the Frost Mages that we might be utilizing later on as that passive elemental ailment that we can throw onto minions. But on top of that, it'll also increase their overall damage. I believe at the beginning point it's 25% or 28%, and it'll keep going up as you level this one up. But it's pretty easy, just throw it down in certain spots, especially during boss fights, let it go out. Now this thing can die pretty easy at certain times, so you may have to cast it a couple more times, but if you throw it in behind the firewall and away from the enemies, generally it will be able to sustain, and since we are utilizing that crowd control effect with Frostbolt, we'll generally be able to hold some of those enemies at bay to where they aren't going to be able to destroy the Pain Offering in certain situations. So it can be a benefit, it does have its negative aspects to it in certain situations, but when you've got a crowd of some of those bone constructs as well as your own minions, it can be an extremely powerful force and just increase your capability at clearing some of those mobs. And on top of that, when it comes down to the supporting gem, you can give all of your minions a 30% increase to their elemental resistances, giving them a bit more survivability with Elemental Army. Now after that, you've got two options when it comes down to the minions. You can choose to have passive elemental ailment inflicted on the enemies in front of you, and those two are going to be Skeletal Arsonist and Skeletal Frost Mage, which obviously the Arsonist is going to apply that ignite and burning effect, whereas Frost Mage is going to give you that chill and some of that freeze capability. And I believe Frost Mage is the better option in my personal opinion. Not only is it great at passively just applying that chill and then can end up freezing them in place, having a bit stronger of a crowd control effect, but at the same time, we will also be able to utilize the ability of Ice Bomb with Frost Mage, which is much better than the ability from Arsonist, where you basically have to wait till one of your minions is on low life and then strike them with the ability to watch them just run in and then explode. Whereas with the Frost Mage's Ice Bomb, we can actually just drop this in and apply that chill effect, slowing the enemy or possibly instantly freezing groups of them. Now, if you have two Frost Mages, two Frost Bombs can very easily be the only thing that you'll need to instantly freeze some of the lesser enemies or even some of those yellow enemies. With stacking enough of it up and on top of that throwing in the frost bolts, it can be a very quick way to stop some of those really fast advancing enemies, especially the ones that just go straight up into your face with that fast melee attack. Sometimes that can be the end of you pretty quickly, but with something like Frost Bomb, those moments can be saved where you'll be able to just drop the Frost Bomb in, freeze the enemy, back up, heal, and then start dishing out some of that damage to finish them off before they're back up in your face again. Overall, it's the better option for me personally, but at the end point, if you're going for a minion build and you want a strong minion build with strong damage from your minions, the Arsonist is going to end up being the better of the two options in that route. If your envisionment for your witch is going to end up going in the minion route, then I would highly suggest just focusing on the Arsonist, getting comfortable with that playstyle of utilizing the Arsonist as a part of your arsenal. But if you're not looking for that and you're looking for more of the elemental damage, applying some of that crowd control effect and just having something that's a bit easier to use and having something that ends up possibly giving you a little bit more survivability, the Frost Mage is going to be the #1 choice. Now, when it comes down to the supporting gems for the Frost Mage, we've got Last Gasp, which this is going to give it 4 seconds after its total life has gone to keep applying some of that chill and freezing some of those enemies. And then right after that, we've got Glaciation, which is just going to cause 50% more freeze buildup, so they're going to be faster at being able to apply that chill and then instantly freeze those enemies. It's going to be a 1-2 punch right here that just ends up being a banger of a skill or a banger of a minion to throw in as some passive elemental ailment. When it comes down to the Arsonist, you can throw Meat Shield on or Last Gasp as well as Feeding Frenzy, just creating a bit more damage with this unit, even though it will take 20% more damage. But if you do throw this on with the Meat Shield, you'll end up having 15% less damage taken as well as 50% more maximum life. So it's dishing out 30% more damage with a little bit less damage getting taken towards itself as well as a much larger life pool. So it's pretty much negating the issue that you have with Feeding Frenzy and then giving you a bit more of that protection, sustaining that damage over time and sustaining that capability of applying that ignite over time. But it's going to be up to you which one that you want. You could do both of them, but since they do have a high spirit cost, you'll more than likely only have one of each until you end up increasing your total spirit later on. But it's there if you'd like it. Generally, I'd say just pick one, that way you can have two of them at any given moment, applying that passive elemental damage towards those enemies. Now, the next skill that we're going to talk about is Ember Fusillade. Now, this would be the skill that I would passively easily be able to use during boss fights or just for single target damage that would instantly be able to just chunk away at the health bar of those bosses or some of those elite units that you may be facing off with, the one with the yellow names. Now, with Ember Fusillade, generally you'll literally just press this skill 7 times, then you'll have 7 red little fireballs floating around you, and after a short period of time, they'll immediately home in on certain enemies in front of you. Now, if you want to guarantee all of the 7 actually going to the same target, or if they're off screen and you want to make sure that this doesn't just fire off towards the walls, as that can happen, just pull your cursor over on top of the enemy unit you want each one of these embers to actually fire off towards, and then it'll hit that target, and within succession after each one fires off, the next one will have a 5% increase to its damage, all the way up to the 35% increase with the final one. So each one has a little 5% incremental increase, so each one is going all the way up. Sure, it's not all of them getting the 35%, but as each one fires off, you're basically stacking the damage, and that's what ends up chunking away at that health pool. And on top of that, it will also be able to ignite those enemies, so it's another one of those moments of increasing the capability of sustaining that elemental ailment on whatever unit you may be facing off with, but it will compound with that. And generally, it's one of those that it's very easy to just click that thing 7 times and then be able to just keep moving, constantly evading some of those attacks and being able to dodge the attacks while still being able to guarantee that damage going in on the target instead of having to channel something or possibly slowly cast and then possibly miss. This one is pretty much one of those set it and forget it moments where you can just easily hit that 7 tap and then just kind of make sure that your cursor's over the enemy you wanted to hit and keep moving. And when it comes down to the supporting gems, I would say fast forward is going to be one of the better options if you want this thing to not have as long a delay before it starts firing off those embers, as it will take some time after you hit the 7th ember floating around you before it actually fires off and hits the target. Sometimes that can be irritating, but with this one you'll actually have less effect duration, which means that it'll be spending 30% less time floating around you before it actually starts firing off at the targets. And just after that, we'll also be getting fire penetration, which the supported skill penetrates through 30% of that fire resistance, making it a bit more impactful versus some of those boss units and those elite units that have a bit of that fire resistance on them. Now, coming up for our final skill, we'll have BONESTORM, which this one grew on me over time. I was not a huge fan of this one at the initial point that I first unlocked it. This will be in the level 3 skills, and by the time I got to it, I thought I really was going to enjoy it, and then I thought to myself that I felt like I needed to fully charge this every time, which if you assume that you have to fully charge this thing to get the maximum damage out of it every time that you use it, it can take a very long time. It's going to slow you down every time that you're charging it up, and it can just feel like a hindrance to you for the actual damage output moment. But if you utilize this thing at about half charge, you'll notice that you'll actually be getting just about the same amount of damage as the full charge, whereas the full charge just seems to have a larger radius of effect and a bit more of the spikes going forward, which sometimes can add a little bit more damage. But in general, if you half charge this thing, throw it at that target, and then hit him again with another half charge, you'll notice this thing starts to chunk away at the actual health bar of any one of those units you'll be hitting with this thing. This thing can just consistently be able to just eat away at the health bar of some of those boss units as well as those yellow units, and on top of that has a good bit of that stagger damage applied to it as well, so you will be able to actually get them to the point of stun locking some of those units a lot quicker by utilizing this in combination with some of your other skills while moving around and in between some of those moments you need to dodge boss attacks. But the big thing is, with each time that you actually plant some of those bone spikes into the unit that you're facing off with, the next time that you strike them will actually have an amplified damage effect. And on top of that, any debuff that's on that target actually doubles the damage of BONESTORM. So anytime you throw Contagion on any one of the units in front of you, you'll end up having double damage with BONESTORM automatically before we even apply the elemental ailment damage increase, the spell damage increase, and the other damage increases we have from possibly critical striking. So this one ends up being better than Ember Fusillade. It's going to be the better option for single target damage, but if you're not comfortable with BONESTORM, I'd say Ember is still going to be a fantastic option for you. But if you're really looking to maximize your damage output and you can get a little bit comfortable with that charge up, BONESTORM is going to be an absolute deadly force for you to use in any one of the boss fights going forward. And I'd make a strong argument you can use Ember Fusillade along with BONESTORM to where you can basically hit the 7 nodes all the way around you and then be able to dodge past one of the attacks, let the embers start striking while you're charging your next BONESTORM and getting the synergetic, strong, powerful attack combo going on where you're just chunking away at the actual health bar of any one of those single targets you're facing off with. Now when it comes down to the supporting gems, you want to use Inevitable Critical. You'll get this by the time you get the support level 2 gems, which this is going to give you a 25% increased critical hit chance each second. So basically, the whole time that we're not using this is ramping up to the point where we can guarantee a critical strike out of it every single time. And since we charge this one up, it's almost inevitable that we'll basically get a critical hit just about every single time. So that's going to give us the bigger bang for our buck when it comes to utilizing BONESTORM and giving us the payoff for having to charge it up as well. But on top of that, we'll also be using Overpower, which this one you can get immediately at the level 1 support gems, giving us 50% more of that stun buildup. I'll tell you right now, there's so many different times where it is so easy for me to be able to stun bosses with this. I'll pretty much just strike them about 3 or 4 times with this, or as we close in to just about half the health bar, right then we've just got that capitalizing moment where we can just easily knock them down to the ground, throw that flame wall in, and just really pelt them with a lot of damage and just finish it off pretty quickly. It's really nice. It's going to be something that just ends up making the BONESTORM a whole lot more useful for you and impactful with yellow units as well. Being able to knock some of those back, especially with that stun power from some of those units that just really are just aggressively in your face, being able to knock them back with BONESTORM is going to help a ton in those moments, and without having to be able to get staggered from this, you'll be able to push forward, deal the damage you need to, and finish off those targets extremely quickly. Now, coming up last when it comes to talking about the skills, we are going to talk about our Persistent, which is going to be our Spirit of the Raging Spirits, which is going to be a minion. So every time that we cast any type of flame skill, more specifically, anytime that we throw out Flame Wall, we're going to have a bunch of these Raging Spirits, a bunch of flaming skulls just going all over the place, and this is another way that we can utilize the capability of Flame Wall, still being able to ignite some of those enemies outside of the Flame Wall as well, as the Raging Spirit has the capability of dealing that fire damage towards the enemies. They'll start rushing forward towards those outside enemies outside of the Flame Wall and be able to ignite them as well, and give you a little bit of that damage on top of that. But when it comes down to the supporting gems with this one, we're going to go with Fire Infusion, which the supported attack gains 25% more fire damage, just giving us a little bit additional damage over time, minus the cold and lightning damage. And then right after that, we've got Ignition, which the supported skills have 100% more chance to ignite, pretty much just giving us a stronger ability for any one of these Raging Spirits to start causing some of that burning damage towards any one of the units outside of the Flame Wall, or sustaining that burning as they move through the Flame Wall itself, and that flaming skull just keeps biting at their ears. Now that's going to be it for the skills. Let's briefly wrap this one up when it comes down to the gear. Now, starting off with the wand, you definitely want to look for a wand that has some type of increased spell damage, critical strike chance, casting speed, anything that just further increases your capability of possibly leeching life per hit. That's going to end up giving you a bit more of that survivability. You don't necessarily need a unique wand. That's just what I have up right now. And this one, by all means, isn't something that you have to have. Generally, there's a lot of rare wands out there that can end up being better than a lot of the uniques in this game, and rares will generally be the better bet unless they have one specific attribute to it that ends up completely capitalizing and enhancing your build. So do keep that in mind as you go forward when it comes to looking for some type of gear in the future. Uniques are not the only thing that will be powerful, and generally, the yellow rares are going to be the most powerful thing you can get as long as they have the right rolls on them. And when it comes down to the helmet, what we're really looking for is a little bit more survivability. Pretty much every bit of the body armor, we're generally going to want to find some type of resistances or energy shield, maximum life, or even just something to do with armor that's further increasing that, as energy shield in a way is going to negate some of that physical damage, but a lot of times armor is the best way to have like a physical resistance to any melee strike that may be hitting you. So in the case of the helmet and the body armor, we should try and find a little bit of armor. That way we have a little bit of protection from those melee strikes. But in the case of the helmet, generally maximum life, critical strike chance, and a little bit of attributes and resistances are generally what you really want out of this. And when it comes down to the scepter, the number one thing that we're actually looking for is just going to be a percentage increase of spirit as high as possible. Doesn't even matter if you find a blue one that has a higher increase to the actual spirit percentage. That one's going to be better than pretty much anything else that you can find. Even if you find a rare later on with more of those allies in your presence gain such and such, you really just want the increase to the spirit to be as high as possible that you can possibly find. Now, finding one with a bit of intelligence or any of the attributes increasing on it is going to be a bit more beneficial, as well as the skeleton warrior skill on top of that, just giving you 2 more of those skeletal warriors at any given time, and it's going to be more useful than possibly whatever skill may come on top of it, because generally those skills you won't even use them and you'll out level them really quickly, so they will become even more useless as you go on. But in general, while leveling this, when it comes down to the scepter, we're really just looking for that maximum increase to our spirit percentage. And one thing to add about the scepter, if you're not somebody that's going for a minion build, or if you do not care about minions and you don't even want to utilize them, then instead of using a scepter, you're going to want to go for a focus or possibly a shield. A shield is just going to increase your capability of survivability, increasing maximum armor, energy, shield, defenses, maximum life on that. That's generally what you're going to get with a shield, whereas a focus is going to be a bit more towards the DPS portion, enhancing the capabilities of your spell damage, your critical strike chance, your cast speed. As you'll notice with this one right here, we've got a 20% increase to cast speed, which can be pretty beneficial, and you can even get some resistances on this, but it's only if you're going for straight up spell damage and nothing to do with the actual minions themselves. But that option's on the table there. Now, when it comes down to the rings, both of these, we want as much resistances as possible. I cannot stress how important that the resistances are as you progress through the campaign and going towards the end game. The more and more your resistances are going to be impacted by the actual increase to the requirement of how much resistance you'll need. So even in the first 2 acts or the first 3 acts, if you have max resistance on cold, lightning, or even fire, you'll notice as you're going into the cruel difficulty, this is substantially going to be diminished, and you'll need to have even more resistances as you go forward. And as you level, you'll need to consistently look for higher level items that have a higher percentage of that resistance and try to maintain that as much as possible. It really is the number one thing you need to look for as you're progressing forward, as ultimately, while leveling and even getting all the way to the point of endgame, when you start to go into maps, you really just want to focus on, with rings especially, and even the amulet, honing in on maximizing those resistances as much as possible, because the ultimate thing that you need is survivability. No matter what, doesn't matter if you have one of these rings that just further gives you a little bit more critical strike chance, but it doesn't give you resistances. That critical strike chance isn't going to matter if you can't walk into a room and not get one shot, or at least one shot something before you get one shot. And even in those instances, sometimes if you one shot it, it may still end up spewing something out that ends up one-shotting you, and you end up having to repeat things. So ultimately, with both rings, just focus on maximum life and anything that gives you resistances. Another benefit that could be on those rings that'll be actually something useful for you is increasing some of those attribute points, but don't go and focus on anything looking for some type of increase to your DPS. Increase to survivability is the number one thing you should be looking for from your point from 1 to all the way up to 60, even past the 40 level we've got here. Anything else beyond that, once you get into maps, that's when you really need to start honing in and looking for a little bit more of that DPS from some of those other rings that you may find out there. Otherwise, before that, it's going to be way too expensive to look for a low-level item that just further increases your overall DPS output alongside trying to also get survivability. If you find one, fantastic, but don't go hunting one, and don't go out of your way to replace one ring that has maximum resistances increasing for you for one that just ends up having no resistances and a little bit of an increase to your overall DPS. And when it comes down to the amulet, if you are going in the direction of wanting the minions and wanting more minions, then you will want to look for an amulet that does have spirit on it. But besides that point, it's very similar to the rings. You want anything that increases your maximum life, attributes, and those resistances. Ultimately, we're just looking for survivability at the very beginning of the game, as the skill tree or weapon and some of those gems with supporting gems are generally going to be able to carry the damage that we really need in the beginning portion. And once we get into the mapping and end game, we'll more than likely have enough currency to start honing in on finding some of those specific pieces of gear that'll carry us in through the end game and find some more of those that end up giving us a bigger benefit and a bigger payout when it comes down to the attributes that roll on them. Now, when it comes down to your chest piece, again, it's pretty much similar to the amulet, except this time you will want to find one with a substantial amount of armor. I don't exactly have a high amount on here, but armor is always going to be beneficial for you, just having a little bit of that physical protection, or at least a physical resistance. But on top of that, if you're looking for the minion build, find one with spirit. You can possibly get one or two more of those minions out if you have a substantial amount of that spirit coming from this, as well as the amulet. But at that same time, maximum life, armor, resistances, you just can't go wrong with it. Any bit of the body armor, you really want to go for something that enhances your survivability as well, but more in the direction of actually having armor, energy shield, and maximum life than resistances themselves as compared to the rings. Now, when it comes down to your gloves, you really want to actually go for something that ends up increasing your DPS capability, such as critical strike chance, casting speed, attack speed, or something along the lines of gaining life per enemy hit. That is actually something that can further increase your survivability, especially if you're fastly casting quite often, similar to what we're doing right now, especially with the FROSTBOLTs. Those things are going out, constantly hitting, and getting a little bit of that life back each time, especially in larger crowds. But you also can't go wrong with finding a little bit of resistance on that, and even armor or energy shield. Now, when it comes down to the belt, this one's all about just increasing armor and resistances. Again, it's just one of those rinse and repeat moments. Some of these pieces of gear are all about just gaining a bit more of that survivability. And right after that, when it comes down to the boots, the number one thing we're looking for is going to be movement speed. Movement is life. It will help you out so much. And I believe the highest you can get on this is going to be 30%, but even at 15%, it's going to be a drastic change for you, a huge improvement. But if you can find one with 30%, doesn't even matter whether or not this thing has resistances or even good attributes on it. Generally, that 30% might be all you need, and it more than likely can carry you all the way into cruel difficulty, if not even all the way to end game. Now, later on, generally will still need to find some with a good bit of resistances, but in the early game portion, having just one pair of boots with garbage stats besides 30% movement speed can be all you really need. And when it comes down to the charm, obviously there is a multitude of different ones that can help you when it comes down to fire or lightning or frozen. Generally, I keep the one that's frozen on all the time, but any one of them that you do find, just kind of store them away. You may need them for a later day when it comes down to a certain boss fight, depending on what their elemental damage type is or what their spells are, what their moves are. It could be something useful later on, but for the most part, Frozen's the number one that I have a problem with actually stopping me and stun locking me, so I usually keep this one on at all times just in case I face off with something that does have that freeze capability. And last but not least, when it comes down to the gear, the health and the mana potion, consistently keep grabbing these up, especially the blue ones. Try to grab as many as you can and make sure that you look them over and see whether or not they are an improvement when it comes down to the total recovered life and total recovered mana, as you will need to constantly change these out as you're going from zone to zone and act to act, as they will consistently increase. And this will be a problem if you don't do this, as your health is always going to be going up as you're constantly getting new gear, increasing the maximum total, and with every level that you gain, you will be gaining more of that life. So if you don't actually upgrade these as you go, not only are you going to start lagging behind, but you may find yourself running empty on these potions more often and not even being able to fully heal yourself. So do keep up with that as you go through. But that's going to be the best leveling build for the Witch from 1 to 40 right there, giving you a nice little backbone blueprint for just being able to cascade yourself forward through that campaign, even into the cruel difficulty, and giving you what feels like a substantial build that will be able to carry you through each one of those boss fights, giving you the damage you need and the synergy between the minions and the spells, or possibly just working straight into the spells to give you every bit of the damage you need to clear through that content. As I know, I was struggling quite a bit in the beginning portion of trying to figure out what direction to go to really empower my Witch, especially since I was trying to use minions in the beginning, and it just didn't end up working out. I wasn't favoring it too much, and it felt like I had to rely on spells at the same time just to kind of push myself through. And the more I leaned into minions, the more I felt as though I was hindering myself. So as soon as I found that nice combination of middle ground between the spells and the minions, it was a much smoother experience, and I enjoyed myself a whole lot more. And hopefully this has helped you out. Let me know down in the comments below if this has helped you, as well as just look at some of the content out there, look at some of the different builds, as with this blueprint, it's very easy to refund a couple of points and then start moving in a solidified direction for whatever build you're looking for, whether it be minions, spell casting, or chaos damage, or some type of hybrid of combination of any one of the three. But let me know what you're rocking as well down in the comments below if you've been enjoying Path of Exile 2 as much as I have, or maybe some of the combinations you have. I'm all ears for different things out there. I'm trying to test as much as possible. I'll be going forward with a Blood Mage build in the coming future with its full-on critical strike damage and just massive amounts of spell power alongside minions to just add some of that elemental damage and ailment onto some of those enemies to really just amplify that damage as we go forward. But we'll have plenty of these builds coming in the future. If you'd like to see more of this content in the future, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily, and on that note, have a good one.